26th of March, 1942. Classified as criminal, asocial and political, they were brought to Auschwitz as founder functionaries of the women's camp. 144. Rudolf Höss wrote of them, "It was easy to predict that these beasts would mistreat the women over whom they exercised power. Spiritual suffering was completely alien to them." 145. They were given serial numbers 1999.46. G. The women's guard from Ravensbrück, Johanna Langefeldt, became first Auschwitz women's camp Lagerfeuerin. 144. A second mass transport of women, 999 Jews from Parkrad, Slovakia, arrived on the same day. According to Danuta Czech, this was the first registered transport sent to Auschwitz by the Reich Security Head Office, RSHA, Office 4B4, known as the Jewish Office, led by SS Obersturmbannführer Adolf Eichmann. 46. Office 4 was the Gestapo. 146. A third transport of 798 Jewish women from Bratislava, Slovakia, followed on 28 March. 46. Women were at first held in blocks 110 of Auschwitz I, 147, but from the 6th of August 1942, 148, 13,000 inmates were transferred to a new women's camp, Frauen Konzentrationslager or FKL, in Auschwitz II. This consisted at first of 15 brick and 15 wooden barracks in sector Bauabschnitt, BIA. It was later extended in Tobig, 149, and by October 1943 it held 32,066 women. 150. In 1943-1944, about 11,000 women were also housed in the Gypsy family camp, as were several thousand in the Theresienstadt family camp. 151. Conditions in the women's camp were so poor that when a group of male prisoners arrived to set up an infirmary in October 1942, their first task, according to researchers from the Auschwitz Museum, was to distinguish the corpses from the women who were still alive. 150. Gisela Pearl, a Romanian Jewish women in Auschwitz II, May 1944. Roll call in front of the kitchen building. Auschwitz I, a gynecologist and inmate of the women's camp, wrote in 1948 there was one latrine for 30 to 32,000 women and we were permitted to use it only at certain hours of the day. We stood in line to get into this tiny building, knee-deep in human excrement. As we all suffered from dysentery, we could barely wait until our turn came, and soiled our ragged clothes, which never came off our bodies, thus adding to the horror of our existence by the terrible smell that surrounded us like a cloud. The latrine consisted of a deep ditch with planks thrown across it at certain intervals. We're squatted on those planks like birds perched on a telegraph wire, so close together that we could not help soiling one another. 152. Langefeldt was succeeded as Lagerfeuerin in October 1942 by SS Oberhofsherrin Maria Mandel, who developed a reputation for cruelty. Höss hired men to oversee the female supervisors, first Obersturmbannführer Paul Muller, then SS Hauptsturmführer Franz Osler. 153. Mandel and Hössler were executed after the war. Sterilization experiments were carried out in Barracks 30 by a German gynecologist, Karl Klauberg, and another German doctor, Horst Schumann. 150. Medical experiments. Block 10. Block 10 Auschwitz I, where medical experiments were performed on women. German doctors performed a variety of experiments on prisoners at Auschwitz. SS doctors tested the efficacy of X-rays as a sterilization device by administering large doses to female prisoners. Karl Klauberg injected chemicals into women's uteruses in an effort to glue them shut. Prisoners were infected with spotted fever for vaccination research and exposed to toxic substances to study the effects. 154. In one experiment, Bayer, then part of IG Farben, paid Rm 150 each for 150 female inmates from Auschwitz. The camp had asked for Rm 200 per woman, who were transferred to Bayer facility to test an anesthetic. A Bayer employee wrote to Rudolf Höss, the transport of 150 women arrived in good condition. However, we were unable to obtain conclusive results because they died during the experiments. We would kindly request that you send us another group of women to the same number and at the same price. The Bayer research was led at Auschwitz by Helmut Vetter of Bayer /IG Farben, who was also an Auschwitz physician and SS captain, and by Auschwitz physicians Friedrich Intrus and Edouard Wirtz. 155. The most infamous doctor at Auschwitz was Joseph Mengele, the Angel of Death, who worked in Auschwitz II from the 30th of May 1943, at first in the Gypsy family camp. 156. Interested in performing research on identical twins, dwarfs, and those with hereditary disease, Mengele set up a kindergarten in barracks. 29 and 31 for children he was experimenting on, and for all Romani children under 6, where they were given better food rations. 157. From May 1944, he would select twins and dwarfs from among the new arrivals during selection. 158. Reportedly calling for twins with Zwillinge Pierots. Twins step forward. 159. Defendants during the doctor's trial Nuremberg, 1946-1947. He and other doctors, the latter prisoners, would measure the twins' body parts, photograph them, and subject them to dental, sight and hearing tests, x-rays, blood tests, surgery, and blood transfusions between them. 160. Then he would have them killed and dissected. 158. Kurt Heismayer, another German doctor and SS officer, took 20 Polish Jewish children from Auschwitz to use in pseudoscientific experiments at the Neuengamme concentration camp near Hamburg, where he injected them with the tuberculosis bacilli to test a cure for tuberculosis. In April 1945, the children were murdered by hanging to conceal the project. 161. A Jewish skeleton collection was obtained from among a pool of 115 Jewish inmates, chosen for their perceived stereotypical racial characteristics. Rudolf Brandt and Wolfram Sivers, general manager of the ONNUB, a Nazi research institute, delivered the skeletons to the collection of the Anatomy Institute at the Rijksuniversiteit Strasbourg in Alsace-Lorraine. The collection was sanctioned by Heinrich Himmler and under the direction of August Hirt. Ultimately 87 of the inmates were shipped to Natzweiler-Struthof and murdered in August 1943. 162. Brandt and Sivers were executed in 1948 after being convicted during the doctor's trial, part of subsequent Nuremberg trials. 163. Punishment. Block 11. Block 11 and left. The death wall. Auschwitz I. 2,000 prisoners could be beaten and killed by guards and kapos for the slightest infraction of the rules. Polish historian Irina Statileko writes that kapos were given nicknames that reflected their sadism: Bloody Iron, the Strangler, the Boxer. 164. Based on the 275 extant reports of punishment in the Auschwitz archives, Statileko lists common infractions: returning a second time for food at mealtimes, removing one's gold teeth to buy bread, breaking into the pigsty to steal the pig's food, putting one's hands into one's pockets. 165. Flogging during roll call was common. A flogging table called the goat immobilized prisoners' feet in a box, while they stretched themselves across the table. prisoners had to count out the lashes 25 mit bisten dank by ch Halton, 25 received with many thanks, and if they got the figure wrong, the flogging resumed from the beginning. 165. Punishment by the post involved tying prisoners' hands behind their backs with chains attached to hooks, then raising the chains so the prisoners were left dangling by the wrists. If their shoulders were too damaged afterwards to work, they might be sent to the gas chamber. Prisoners were subjected to post for helping a prisoner who had been beaten, and for picking up a cigarette butt. 166. To extract information from inmates, guards would force their heads onto the stove, and hold them there, burning their faces and eyes. 167, known as Block 13 until 1941. Block 11 of Auschwitz I was the prison within the prison, reserved for inmates suspected of resistance activities. 168, Cell 22 in Block 11 was a windowless standing cell, bunker. Split into 4 sections, each section measured less than 1.0 square meter, 11 square feet, and held 4 prisoners, who entered it through a hatch near the floor. There was a 5 centimeters, 2 in 2 in, vent for air covered by a perforated sheet. Statilecker writes that prisoners might have to spend several nights in cell 22. Wes Law class spent 4 weeks in it for breaking a pipe. 169. Several rooms in Block 11 were deemed the Polizeiersatz-Gefängnis Misslowitz in Auschwitz, Auschwitz branch of the police station at Misslowitz. 170. There were also Sonderbehandlung cases, special treatment, for Poles and others regarded as dangerous to Nazi Germany. 171. Death Wall. The death wall showing the death camp flag, the blue and white stripes with a red triangle signifying the Auschwitz uniform of political prisoners. The courtyard between blocks 10 and 11, known as the death wall, served as an execution area, including 4 Poles in the general government area who had been sentenced to death by a criminal court. 171. The first executions, by shooting inmates in the back of the head, took place at the death wall on 11 November 1941, Poland's National Independence Day. The 151 accused whirled to the wall one at a time, stripped naked and with their hands tied behind their backs. Danuta noted that a clandestine Catholic Mass was said the following Sunday on the 2nd floor of Block 4 in Auschwitz I, in a narrow space between bunks. 172. An estimated 4,500 Polish political prisoners were executed at the death wall, including members of the camp resistance. An additional 10,000 Poles were brought to the camp to be executed without being registered. About 1,000 Soviet prisoners of war died by execution, although this is a rough estimate. A Polish government in exile report stated that 11,274 prisoners and 6,314 prisoners of war have been executed. 173. Rudolf Höss wrote that execution orders arrived in an unbroken stream. 170. According to SS officer Perry Broad, some of these walking skeletons had spent months in the stinking cells, where not even animals would be kept, and they could barely manage to stand straight. And yet, at that last moment, many of them shouted "Long live Poland," or "Long live freedom." 174. The dead included Colonel Jan Kach and Major Edward Gotgettinsky, executed on the 25th of January, 1943 with 51 others suspected of resistance activities. Joseph Nogi, the Polish long-distance runner, was executed on 15 February that year. 175. In October 1944, 200 Sonderkommando were executed for their part in the Sonderkommando revolt. 176. Family camps. Gypsy family camp. Romani children, Malfingen, Germany, 1943. The children were studied by Eva Justin and later sent to Auschwitz. 177, a separate camp for the Roma. The Zigener family in Lager, Schipsifamily camp, was set up in the BIE sector of Auschwitz II-Birkenau in February 1943. For unknown reasons, they were not subject to selection and families were allowed to stay together. The first transport half-German Roma arrived on the 26th of February that year. There had been a small number of Romani inmates